its way. So Dianne, that means that you go first. How are you?
I'm just fine. Having relatively nice weather. It's been back and forth here in Michigan, where it'll be in the 70s for a while. And then today it's kind of hot and sticky. So,
Right. So you're on the east side of the lake. I grew up on the west side of the lake where when the wind changed, the temperature could drop an easy 50 degrees in like 2 hours.
no, we do not have that.
Lucky you. And you do spend part of the year here in Scottsdale. So you're coming back, am I right, sometime in September?
That's exactly right. I'll be there probably about the 15th.
Wonderful. Well, it'd be great to see you again. So Stephanie, I haven't had a chance to meet you before. Tell us where you are and how's the weather and all that good stuff.
I'm in Houston, and the weather for in Houston summer is really never any good. It's super hot and muggy. So just trying to get through it.
Yeah, no, I know. Houston is basically, well, what isn't it called, the Bayou City, which sort of means it's a swamp.
Yeah, it is. Definitely. Right. It feels like it too.
So just as hot as Scottsdale, but with the additional benefit of humidity and mosquitoes.
Well, we don't usually get into the hundreds. So that's at least a benefit. But yeah, the humidity is rough.
Yeah, well, come on. I grew up in Chicago where when it was 90 degrees and raining, it was much hotter than it ever is in Phoenix when it's 105 and we have 8% humidity. So I don't buy that. However, we've had a very strange summer, since we're talking about weather here for a minute, where we've had quite a lot of rain and floods. Not anything like the horrible scale they've experienced in Germany and Belgium and even part of Holland, but for Phoenix, really a lot of water. So there we are. How about you, Claire? Where are you?
I'm in Iowa, and I can relate to what you were commenting about Chicago. Is the other day I think it was 88 degrees, but the feels like temperature was 105. So because of the humidity and but I just got air conditioning in my house for the first. I live in a house that was built in 1890s, so we just got central air conditioning in my house 2 days ago for the first time. So I am loving this.
Happy dance all the way around. Oh, I remember when I was a child, my mother used to put up damp sheets and then blow a fan through them. And my grandfather bought one of the very first air conditioned cars. It was a big Cadillac, and it must have been in the very early 50s. And we would all pile in the car and drive around, for no purpose other than just to be sitting there in the air conditioning. So we've all come a long way since. And this is particularly ironic since we're going to be talking about England, and we're going to be talking about not current England, so colder England. And because I'm reliably informed, they are actually planting vineyards in England at this point. It's gotten so warm. And in fact, Martin Walker, who writes the wonderful Bruno Chief of Police stories, said that the first vineyard in Scotland has been planted. So that's a really scary thought if you think about, climate change going up. Right. So I'm going to assume it's now 4 o'clock and we can talk about real things here instead of weather. So I am going to do this alphabetically for the moment. So I'm going to go back to Dianne and ask her, here is her new book, A Fiance's Guide to First Wives and Murder. And right there in that title, First Wives and Murder and Fiance, indicates something is really wrong. So it's a Countess of Harley mystery. Is this the fourth one, Dianne?
It is number 4.
And this is where there's been a sort of change in title because the first 3 were slightly different.
Yeah, the first 3 were a lady's guide. And for people who don't know, when you sell a book, you usually get a contract, if you're doing a series, to write a few. And nobody, not the publisher, not you, not your agent, nobody knows if that's going to continue. So when they bought book 4, 5, and 6, the sales department came back and said, you cannot keep calling them a lady's guide to this and that. It just gets people confused. And, I had no idea because there's purple book, pink book, blue book, and now yellow book. So I don't know where the confusion is, but they said it was. So that was not a hill I was going to die on. I said, okay, that's fine. We'll come up with something. And these actually, the titles that we have for the next group are just like even a little more descriptive because now we've changed the noun as well. So this particular book, did you ask me to say anything about this?
Yes, no, I was going to ask you to carry on. I was just sort of easing into it. So do.
I got a little gabby for a moment. This particular book, Frances has finally married off her sister, and now she and George can announce their engagement. George Hazelton is her fiance and has been kind of her partner in crime for a few books, or crime solving anyway. So now they're excited. They're planning an engagement party. They're making plans for their wedding, and the only thing that can stand between the two of them and a life of wedded bliss is his wife.
His first wife, right?
His first wife, who shows up with Inspector Delaney almost on Frances's doorstep and claims to be related to the Grand Duke Michael Mikhailovich, to the Queen, claims to be George's wife, not his first wife, but his wife, his only wife, still married. And Frances thinks she's just delusional. There's something wrong with this woman. And a couple of days later, when she is found dead in Frances's backyard, she and George are the prime suspects. So now they have to kind of wade through some of her crazy stories that she's told them to determine what's true, what's false, and what might lead them to the killer.
So if this is a fiance's guide, are you anticipating a really long engagement, as in 2 more books, or are you going to waltz up a different title?
The next book will actually be a bride's guide to marry the murder.
Okay.
So I'm not gonna postpone it very long at all.
Sorry, that was a spoiler. I shouldn't have asked.
You could eventually have asked me what my next book is, so.
Okay, I won't do that. So Stephanie, your guide, your book, Olive Bright Pigeoneer, was your debut, or at least it certainly was the start of a series, but was it also your first novel?
It was not my first novel. It was my first mystery. I had written a few romantic novels under a pseudonym prior to Olive Bright Pigeoneer. But yes, this is my first mystery. It is part of a series. And should I give you a short description?
Sure.
Basically, it's set during World War II, and Olive is a veterinary student whose family has a loft of racing pigeons. And she is basically, because of the Blitz, she kind of got pulled from school and is back in her home village. And she's looking for something to do for the war effort, something more significant, she thinks, than rolling bandages or knitting hats. So she's kind of hunting around when an opportunity presents itself for her to not only put herself to work, but also her pigeons with an intelligence organization working for the war. And shortly thereafter, a body is found outside her family's pigeon loft. And so she's kind of pigeoneer, sleuth, all at once. She gets thrown into everything.
It's fascinating. I mean, there are so many different aspects to World War II and so many stories coming out, particularly stories of what women did in the war more than military aspects. And we'll come back to, how much real historical fact is absorbed into the fiction, or how much the fiction rests on real historical fact. I learned a lot from Stephanie's book, all of which truly surprised me. So it was great. So let's talk to Claire and tell us a little bit about Murder at Keyhaven Castle.
Yeah, so that's the third book in the series. It's about an American heiress, kind of like a $1 Million Princess, if you think Cora from Downton Abbey. She was American heiress, and there was a lot during that era. There's a lot of Americans who would go to Britain to get married off and infuse their funds into the British society that was kind of floundering with a lot of debt at the time. And so her father in the first book, her father decides to sell her off. He is a Kentucky horse breeder, and he kind of decides to sell her off like one of his prize horses to a Viscount so he can get into Mrs. Astor's ballroom in Newport. And she doesn't like that. And so the Stella is the main character, and Lindy, Viscount Lyndhurst, is her fiance. And at first they don't really get along very well. But the vicar ends up dying in that book, and they have to kind of solve the murder, and they kind of bond over it. So in this book, their wedding is actually imminent, a few days off. And as with any wedding, family and friends from all over kind of descend on their manor house in Hampshire, which is, the series is set in like you said, the New Forest in Hampshire. And some of those guests are not only uninvited, but they are completely not wanted. They're really unwelcome. And so you get a little bit more of some of the American relatives show up, and then there's also some of the British relatives show up. So there's a lot more backstory, a lot more. You find out a lot more about the characters, where they kind of came from. And so this book kind of involves horse racing scandals, and I even kind of pulled in a little bit of American Wild West stories, and then eventually they kind of, to get away from all this stuff that's going on, before kind of wind down, there's always a day or two before a wedding, you just kind of want to step away from the planning and kind of chill. And so they all go on this excursion to Key Haven Castle, and a murder occurs there that kind of turns both of their lives upside down, and the wedding gets postponed again, maybe, and you'll have to read the book to find out. So
Okay. So what we know from all this is that Ava Vanderbilt, who became Ava Belmont, who was the queen of Newport society. If you go there, you can go visit the Marble House and so forth. But part of the impulse in the so-called golden age, I'm trying to remember, Gilded Age in New York, sorry, was to marry off daughters for social advancement. Right. And willing grooms in England who had the upkeep of serious castles and estates and no money. So that's based on real life. Consuelo Vanderbilt, Ava's daughter, was forced to marry the heir to the dukedom of Marlborough. It was not a happy marriage. It resulted in divorce eventually, but the money stayed there. Winston Churchill's mother, Jenny Jerome, is another example of that. And of course there were more. And then there were some people who, I mean, some women who voluntarily went to England and married into the aristocracy. It wasn't always that they were victims of their mothers. But, in a way, it's a really interesting book for the Me Too era, because really it was abusive. To have these girls, Consuelo was more or less locked up and, forced to marry. I'm trying to remember what his name was. I want to say George, but I don't think that was his name.
Oh, Marlborough is the Duke of Marlborough.
Well, he was the heir, yeah, but I'm trying to remember what his first, but it doesn't matter what his first name was. So in that vein, Dianne, tell us about Frances, the Countess of Harley. Was hers a voluntary marriage or forced?
No, it was voluntary, and I think most of them actually were. Very few of the mothers of that era were like Ava Vanderbilt. She was,
one hopes,
extremely controlling, and both her children had the short end of that stick. But with Frances, what these women were dealing with, they were newcomers to New York. They were new money. Their fathers were sometimes unsavory. In Frances's case, that wasn't it. Her father had been an inventor, and then he found out that what he really seemed to invent was money. Anything he touched just really did well. So he turned to the stock market. And she and her mother just couldn't get into New York society, and that was not uncommon. So Frances was stuck with the idea of, okay, well, maybe my dad will bring home some junior partner for me to marry, or I could remain a spinster, or I could take my chances across the Atlantic. And they were much more accepting. They were going through an agricultural depression during the last quarter of that century, and they really needed the influx. So that's what she did. Hers was voluntary, but she was 18, so she really didn't know too awful much about it, but she was taking a chance. And when these women did that, their parents turned over a huge dowry and then waved goodbye and went back to America, because yes, they could get into Mrs. Astor's drawing room now. And they were left alone, hoping that this man and his family would treat them well. And in Frances's case, her husband pretty much just ignored her. He dropped her off at the country home and he went about his business. He just kept his bachelor ways and kind of ignored the fact that he had a wife. And then ultimately, the first book opens, Frances is a widow and she's just gone through her first year of mourning. So he ultimately dies.
So Stephanie, even though you're jumping up to World War II rather than being in the Gilded Age, latter part of the 19th century, you still have a girl whose father can largely dictate what she does. It's hard for her to break, the bonds of family and even of class to do what she wants to do.
Yes, that is actually a problem for her. And I don't want to, there are no spoilers because this happens right at the beginning of the novel. Basically, when she's given the opportunity to be put to work for the war with her birds, the condition is that she has to do it without telling her family, her friends, or specifically her father, because she's hoping, the whole family is hoping initially that the birds are going to be accepted into the National Pigeon Service, which is widespread, used across the services. Basically, you provide birds, and then the Army or the Navy or whichever of the services, they're in charge of what gets done with them. So in the novel, her father believes himself to know best and does not want to relinquish control. He doesn't believe that these other trainers or pigeoneers know what he knows, that he thinks he could do better. So they don't want to work with him. So the National Pigeon Service is not willing to vet her birds. And so she's kind of floundering, because if the birds are not being used for the war effort, then there's not going to be any pigeon feed, because the feed is reserved for birds that are being used for the war effort. So then basically that's one of the main reasons she agrees to go along with the secret, keeping everything from her father, which is difficult, of course, because they're really his birds, but you got to do what you got to do, I guess. But he's generally, I think, a good father, but yeah, he's a little prickly, a little bossy. He's really not forcing her into marriage.
It's an unconventional thing for a girl at that time to be doing. So I'm sure that that's part of it. So I was going to ask you all what drew you to write about England as opposed to America. And you two, Clara and Dianne, have kind of answered it. In one way you've worked out to do it is you've used an American as your viewpoint character. So you don't have to be really British, in order to write it. But Stephanie, you've chosen to write about a British family. Why did you do that? I mean, what interested you? Was it the pigeons? Was it the war? What was it that drew you in?
Well, both the Americans and British used pigeons, so I could have really gone either way. But I wanted to have it set in Britain, the home front in Britain, because they were so much more it was so much more fraught. I mean, things were happening in Britain, and they were really struggling, and with all the food was not coming in. There's all the victory gardens, the evacuations, the Blitz, and all that. Where it's really, they're kind of sitting pretty in America. So it wasn't as intense of a wartime situation as it was in Britain. So that was really why I chose to have it set over there.
Well, that makes really good sense. Clara, what appealed to you about the New Forest? I mean, you could have worked this out for virtually any county in England.
Yeah, I could have. When I decided that horses were kind of going to be a continuing theme through the book, her father is a Kentucky horse breeder, and she's an accomplished horsewoman herself. I actually was looking for some place in Britain that she would eventually feel comfortable in and kind of bond with, because she was going to get stuck there. And when I found that New Forest is one of its values, and one of the things that it's famous for is its free range New Forest ponies that are endemic to the area. And And then when I learned that it was kind of a unique area with the, it's not being a forest, it's actually more of an open grassland, more, area, but it just seemed a little bit like a place that would feel a little bit more like home for her. So
That makes good sense. Plus, it has a kinder climate than if you'd gone to, say, Northumberland, where,
Right.
where it's pretty
Absolutely.
ghastly. So, Diane, in your case, most of the aristocracy had homes, townhomes, mansions, whatever you want to call them, in London, but most of them also had country estates. Hence many of their titles are actually premised upon the geographical location of, where their property is. So, this book does take place in London and is centered on an interesting visit. And I like the fact that that you picked a real visit in time, 1899, but some of the things, and we'll get to this question later, happened earlier, but you decided, you'd kind of mash it all up. So London would be the logical place. Where else can you imagine that these stories would take place? Where have they taken place? Have they all been in London, or have they been on the estate?
They've been largely in London. The first book starts when Frances leaves the family home because her husband has passed away and there's a new Earl of Harley, and she doesn't really belong there. She kind of wants some independence. For Frances, like either a little cottage somewhere, which kind of isn't her style. She's always been a city girl, or London. The thought for her of going home to her parents was just no, that was not a choice for her. It was certainly possible, but that would put her right back where she started. And she kind of was looking for some independence. So London was really her only option. And she no longer has ties to a country home. In the book, book 3 takes place at George's family seat, his brother's home, his brother who is the Earl of Hertford. And they are out there having a shooting party and a house party. So because I have always wanted to go to a country house party, and I thought that would be lovely. So when Lily was getting married, I'm like, okay, you know what? We're going to do this out in the country, and we're going to have a shooting party, and we're going to have archery, and we're going to have horse riding, and we're going to have all the tea parties and all that fun stuff. So those are.
I actually have been to one. I met some people who had a wonderful estate. It was back in the 80s when I lived in England for a few months. And they had a wonderful estate in Lancashire, and they were famous for raising pheasants. And they did have shooting parties, but by now, even in the 80s, they were really designed as economic engines. They were not, inviting the Prince of Wales and 14 of his friends to slaughter 2,000 pheasants. It was a money-making deal. And they were very kind, and they invited me to have a gun and go out with the shooting party. And I realized how much money they were charging people, to do that. And I just couldn't bring myself to, I didn't have that much cash at that point anyway. But aside from that, it was an amazing gesture. So I refused, and I wandered around with the beaters, which was really fun because you get to ride in the vehicles and you get to drink and the whole bit. And then they have this grand lunch when it's all over. So the only thing I didn't do was actually shoot the pheasants. And I've always been pleased that I did that. But, it was a strangely Edwardian experience. But it's surprising what a business it has become. You have to pay people, you have to raise the birds, you have to keep the property for the birds, you have to, do all this other stuff. So what were gentlemen's pursuits at the time that you and Clara are writing has really turned into a business to a great degree, knocking some of the romance out.
yes.
I was fortunate because I haven't been able to get to England in a few years. So I was fortunate that the time that I did go, I got to visit Audley End House. And that's what I modeled Risings off of, the estate that George's family owns.
Right.
But I did not get to do any sort of a shoot. But the person, someone in modern times, the person I did go to get my information does that now. So he has done what you were talking about and gone on these shoots on these big estates, and he was able to explain to me exactly how that works. So that was fortunate. It's like,
Oh, well, that's what the British call proper jobs now, as opposed to, because their staff has been so reduced. It used to be, they would have dozens of gardeners on major estates, and they would have gamekeepers and kennel keepers and horse keepers and the whole bit, which is economically more difficult now. So the tourist industry is to a great degree sustaining it. And, it's interesting. I was thinking about your castle, Claire, that climate change is actually endangering some of these properties, particularly those on the water. There's a castle down on the channel that was, I think, built under Henry VIII, if I remember right, as a defense. And part of it's now crashed into the sea.
That is actually, it's Hearst Castle that you're
Yep.
thinking of.
I
And
am.
that's actually the castle that I modeled Key Haven
That's what I
after.
thought.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say that, yeah, the one part of the wall actually slid into the soul.
Yeah, and over time, some of those chalk cliffs have crumbled, and villages and so forth have fallen into the sea. So
Yeah.
Stephanie, you're more inland. Where exactly is Olive Bright? I say rural, but I'm being vague. Where is she?
She's in a fictional village in Hertfordshire, which is,
Okay.
I mean, I really patterned it off of, it's similar to, well, it is near where the Brickendenbury Manor, where she's working with the intelligence group, is an actual manor house and was requisitioned for the war effort. So it's basically a fictional village right near there. And I sort of patterned Little Lambwell, Hertfordshire, if you've heard of that. It's about, I think.
I know where it is, and it's
Oh,
safely
okay.
inland. So,
Yes,
she's,
yeah,
it's not
definitely, yeah.
gonna crash into the ocean.
Yeah.
Right. So a question I'd like to ask all of you, and I think it's a really interesting one, is as historical novelists, as opposed to writing historical, nonfiction and all, how much liberty do you feel able to take with actual events? And do you change them somewhat to suit the plot of your book? So I know Dianne does, or did, because she wrote that in the afterword for her book. So why don't we start with you? You tell us what really happened and why you changed it.
Well, what really happened was that the Grand Duke Michael Mikhailovich and his wife visited the Prince of Wales in November of 1899. I'm a little bit ahead of that now at what I'm writing, so I had to think back. And that kind of triggered something for me because I had a character. I don't know if everybody else does this, but occasionally I have a character kind of in my back pocket and I'm just waiting for the right story to use them. And I thought this was the perfect place for that. And she's the one who ended up being Irina. With that, I know that there are certain, Francis and George go to the ballet, so I know that there are some Russian operas, or I'm sorry, they go to the opera, and I found one, and yes, it was performed, and the main actress was Fanny Mooney, and she didn't do it in 1899. I think she did it more like in 1879 or something like that. So yeah, things that actually happened, but not necessarily then. Alexei, the father of my fictional Irina Teskey, he did take a world trip, Grand Duke Alexei, to the US, but that was in the 1870s. And I had him doing it at that time. So yeah, I think as long as you indicate that this is why I'm doing this, I think you can get away with it. It works with the plot. This is the first time I've used real people as characters. So this is the first time I've done that. Gosh, I don't know if I've ever played with anything in the other 3 books, in the 3 previous books.
Well, you did cover your ass nicely, by putting in the actual dates and all. Maybe that's all that's really required. I know Tasha Alexander and I have had a fairly spirited discussion about this because she's writing a Lady Emily set in Egypt, in Luxor, before the Winter Palace, which is my favorite Victorian hotel. It's still standing, about 3 years before it was built. And, I said to her, relax. just move it a couple of years forward because it's perfect. And she, I don't know whether she will or not, but I think it's an interesting question. Clara, what's your position? Because you're back there in the same time frame, roughly.
Right. I really try to keep as close as I can to historical fact. I actually had them talking about Peter Pan, going to Peter Pan in London, and I actually put in my author's note that Peter Pan actually came out 6 months earlier than what they said. But I think that's probably maybe the only thing that I did that in historical fact that I tweaked. Usually in like you're talking about like a hotel in Egypt or something, I think if I find that it's not there or there's something, then like in the case of that Hearst Castle, instead of using the actual castle, I renamed it and kind of fictionalized it because the actual castle that I based it on was a military installation that actually functioned until the 50s, until well after World War II. They still used it in World War II. So obviously tourists weren't wandering around in 1905. So I fictionalized it. And I think that's how I get around the using the historical fact. And I tend, like Dianne, I tend to shy away from using real people. One time I mentioned King Edward, but he was at the Derby races, and he would have been there, but of course he didn't meet my fictional characters, but he was there. And I try to use the horses that actually ran the race. And if I change the name because I have one of my character's horses running the race, then I'll put it in my author's note and say, well, actually the real horse that, that placed in this race was named blank, but I really tried to keep as close as I can to historical fact, or I change.
An author's note is a really useful thing, so that you can try to ward yourself off from there are a number of readers, particularly in mystery, who just can't resist pointing out either errors of fact or, real history and so forth. I've always thought that people, certainly it's true for me, and I think for many people, read crime fiction to learn things, because it's a wonderful way to explore a lot of things and livelier than nonfiction. But then there are people who are really, I remember an historical novel, I've never forgotten this, it was written about some woman, and that either 12 P.C. Doherty, who's written like 4,000 historical novels. And anyway, she was spinning. And he actually got a note from somebody that said that the spindle he used was not right for 1170 or something. You can take it to a serious extreme. But I do think that if you have an author note where you say, okay, it really happened here, but I moved it here, or it's really this, but I decided to call it that, it's kind of a good thing. But Stephanie, you have a slightly different problem because you're not that far removed. You're at least 50 years up in the, closer. And the events of World War II are so well known. You felt, I would imagine that you feel like you have to stick pretty closely to the actual facts.
Yes, that's true. I do feel that, I want to obviously make it as authentic as possible. And one of the things that I really liked about writing this novel was that I thought, as far as I'm concerned, I read a good amount of World War II books, fiction and nonfiction, and I feel like the home front side of things isn't nearly as well covered as the what was going on in occupied Europe. And so all the little things that the Women's Institute and the Girl Guides and all of those different groups did for the war effort, I thought that was lesser covered and it would keep things a little bit lighter. And so I really tried to do my research on all of those different elements to make it really authentic, but also I don't have a real person that's readily identifiable in Olive Bright, but as I mentioned, the manor house is a real manor house and was requisitioned, and it was used for the purpose that I am having it used in the novel. So I really was trying to make sure that things that I was having happen there could really have happened there. The only thing that I have no record of is that they might have had a pigeoneer at their disposal, but I figure they easily could have, because I did find record, and I mentioned this in an author's note, of a woman in a different village who was raising pigeons for the same intelligence organization. So I figured they could easily have had one, there's just no records that I have found. So really that's I think my main reach. Otherwise, I think everything is historically possible and could have been how it actually was, or is, if I did find documentation. So
one of the useful things about author notes is that you can not only do these, checkbacks to real facts and so forth, but in Stephanie's book, the thing I loved about the author notes, there's a real hero pigeon. I had no idea that this pigeon, which actually earned a medal.
Oh, there's a ton of them though.
Well, I know, but the one I was really gripped by the one that you told us about. So tell us about his absolutely astonishing flight. I mean, it reminds me so much of one of my favorite Georgette Hare novels. In fact, my very favorite Georgette Hare novel, which is called The Civil Contract. And at the end, when Adam has speculated on the change, it's all about whether Napoleon or Wellington is going to be victorious at Waterloo, and if it's Napoleon, he's going to lose everything, and if it's Wellington, he's going to be okay. And the message has to come in, and it made me think about your pigeon who flies this astonishing route in order to bring news of victory. I mean, just amazing.
They are really. I mean, when I started thinking that I wanted to write a mystery, it came immediately into my head that I wanted there to be pigeons involved, which is super strange, but I think they've been in the back of my mind since I took my kids to see that Disney movie Valiant like 20 years ago or 15 years ago. And I think I liked the movie more than they did. I mean, it was just kind of fascinating that pigeons could be so instrumental in carrying messages for the war effort. And I mean, I was just totally, when I decided to start to hunker down and write about that, I mean, I found all the research fascinating and just was super impressed.
Well, Stephanie's novel is called Olive Bright Pigeoneer, and I'm telling you, you want to buy a copy of it, if for nothing else than to read the author note. The book is great, but the real draw, the series draw, is the author note. It's absolutely fascinating. Are you planning on writing more about this character, about Olive Bright?
Yes, actually, the next book in the series is coming out in January, and so Olive will be kind of moving forward with her job with the intelligence organization, and there will be an author note.
Nifty. Well, we'll have to talk then, because I really want to pursue this whole thing. And how about you, Claire? Are you working on another book?
I am. I'm working on the 4th in the series. It's going to be the honeymoon of Stella and Lindy, my characters, and they're honeymooning in York. So they're going north.
Great. York is one of my favorite places. Years and years ago, back in the 80s, when I went to York, I did a lot of studying, and I discovered that there was an ancient inn in the Bootham Bar Gate, and the Bootham Bar Gate is right next to York Minster. And the description was that if you took the room at the top of the Bootham Bar Gate, whatever it was, and you lay there, you would feel as though you were in medieval times, because you would hear the bells of the minster and nothing else would disturb you. The flaw in that, I discovered when I got there, is there was no elevator. And so you had to drag all your luggage up, like I don't remember how many flights of stairs. And additionally, one of my totally favorite memories is that York is full of these little narrow streets, yes, some of which are one way for obvious reasons. Yep. And I got there late on a Friday night when everybody's out hitting the pubs. So streets are full of drunken revelers and you can hardly make any progress. And I could not get to this hotel, no matter how hard I tried. The map that I had, I could not find this hotel, a way to drive to it. And finally, in desperation, I thought, I know what I'll do. So I drove the wrong way up a one-way street And sure enough, a Bobby miraculously appeared, stormed over to the car, looked down at me ferociously. And I looked up at him and I said, here's my problem. I said, I'm desperate. So I needed to attract your attention. I can't find this. And he looked at me for a moment. And then he said, shove over, love. He said, I'll drive you there. And he got into the car and he had this huge hat and it was a little car. So he put the hat in my lap and, clashed the gears. And it turned out there was some weird little turn that if you didn't know it, you'd never find it. And we arrived at the hotel and then he smiled at me and he said, I'd have to give you a ticket. He said, if you park the car here. Because there's whatever he said, but there is a garage down there, a garage down there, and I'll give you 2 hours before I come back and make sure that you have. So I had to drag the luggage up all these flights of stairs. It was an exhausting experience, but I love York, and you can walk around the walls right? And you can do everything. And do you know Candace Robb's wonderful mystery series set in medieval York? Mm-hmm. By Owen Archer is as an aide to the Archbishop of York, and it's a really spectacular series. Danny, any of you know it? Are you interested in medieval England? No? Yes, well.
I'm not familiar with it.
Well, I can highly recommend it. ROBB, her first name is Candace, and she's a real historian, but she does a wonderful job navigating the politics of Richard II. And the Nevilles in York, which is wonderful. So you'll have a good time there. Dianne, you've already told us that that you are working on your 4th book, and then you apparently have a contract for 5 and 6. So that's really good news. And Dianne, I was there when Dianne won award for, was it best first novel or best historical novel at Left Coast Crime?
It was first.
Best first novel. Yeah, it was very exciting for all of us because after all, she lives in Scottsdale part-time, so we have like a stake in Dianne. But anyway, so it was wonderful to know that, or to be there and to witness that. So let me see if Pat, there he is, just perfect timing. There you are, PK.
Hey,
do you
how's it
have
going?
any comments or questions you'd like to forward from the audience?
Absolutely, and audience, feel free to continue to ask your questions as you're going through. So first of all, I've got to say that our audience here are big fans of all 3 of you. So that is really wonderful. Emily Grindell Dame said she loved Olive Bright Pingineer, and she's excited because both Dianne and Clara are new authors to her, and she can't wait to read your books. So congratulations, you're making some new fans here today. Emily also wants to know if, for all 3 of you, do you normally travel to the location that you're going to be researching for a book? I know this is a question specifically to England, but depending on where your books are set, do you actually travel there?
You could do this alphabetically. It'd probably be easier to answer the questions that way. So Dianne, that puts you up first.
It was my travel to England that kind of inspired it. That's where Francis's house really is a house, and it really is where I say it is. And having seen that one time, just walking around London, kind of made me think, gosh, I could put a character in that house, and I think that would work really well. Since then, I have not been able to go back, and been trying for the past 3 years to get there. And that's going to be an issue because Marriage and Murder is next. And I keep saying, they're not going to go on a honeymoon unless I can go somewhere. So they can't go anywhere. I can't go anywhere. So we'll just have to see. But yeah, I can't imagine writing about a place without having seen it, even though I see it now and not 1899. Do you guys agree?
Yes.
I have not been to, so imagine it. I have not had the pleasure of visiting Hertfordshire and the location, the Brickendenbury Manor. I would have loved to go, but I have not. I think probably if the whole COVID situation hadn't kind of derailed things, I probably would have been by now, but I've not. I've only been to I've been to Scotland one time many years ago, but never anywhere in England. So I'm actually really looking forward to the opportunity of going. And I just did my best with all of the research materials available, and thank heaven for the internet. There's really just a lot of information.
Yeah. I actually took 2 separate research trips specifically for my book. So the New Forest has a wonderful research library and heritage museum that I just spent, hours and hours and hours poring over very local material that you can only find there. And but yeah, I've been very lucky to be able to take 2 separate trips to just research my series. Yeah, I can't imagine doing it without having actually walked and been there. Yeah.
Well, COVID's been very hard on a lot of authors. We talked to Deborah Crombie the other night, and she's really suffering from not going back to England to research her Duncan Kincaid and Gemma James series. And Charles Todd, who was 2 people, are having the same problem, that they're so used to being able to go and travel and visit. So it's hard to say, what the ripple on effect, how long it will be before travel feels safe or even possible, and what authors are going to have to do to get around it. Anyway, PK, carry on.
Actually, I'm rather curious. So when do you know that your research is done? Because you could research probably till the cows come home, right?
Sure.
Yeah, you probably only use about 10% of what you actually uncover. And that's definitely part of the work, is just to figure out, okay, this is too much, and I need a little bit more here. So it's definitely a nuanced thing to do. Yeah.
You can spend a lot more time than you really have, going down these rabbit holes. And so I guess basically the research is done when the deadline is looming.
That's
And
right.
you have everything you need. It's just really interesting. So I think that might be it, when the deadline's looming and you've got to finish this.
So I have a question, which is, do you obviously do some research and travel to spark off the idea, but when you write, you can also, I'm speaking of an author well known to me whose process this is, writes along, and then there will be like a parentheses, an asterisk, look this up or figure this out or something. And there's general research to spark you, but then there's specific research if you need to know a fact. And if you stop every time you need the specific thing, you might lose the flow of the writing. So which do you find works better for you, to do as much as you can ahead of time, or to do some and then go back when you've got the whole story written out and fill in the stuff that you need to know?
I do enough ahead of time to get the plot. My first drafts are always just plot and dialogue. They're very short. They're very kind of skimpy. And alongside in the margin is everything I need to look up to make this right. I'll be writing something and think, how do I know that? Is that true? Oh, do I know this? Or do I just think this? So there's constant notes of things that I have to look up. So usually between draft 1 and 2 is when I do most of my research.
Okay, how about you, Stephanie?
I am like the exact opposite. I cannot, something about how my brain works, I've tried actually many times to write down, okay, go look this up. It just is like ticking in the back of my mind that I have this blank spot in my manuscript that says insert native plant here. And I just can't. I have to just go and look it up. And I do write pretty clean first drafts. There's sometimes like plot holes or things that need to be fixed. But when I'm done with the first draft, it's pretty solid. So I'm basically the exact opposite.
I'm like Dianne. Oh, I'm pointing over there. I'm like Dianne. My first draft has all kinds of parentheses that says look up, describe, and those are just kind of placeholders for me to go back to, because I do a lot of the research ahead of time, and sometimes I don't even know what I have. I've just kind of like photocopied things that I know I might need, and So I do that quick first draft, and then it's that second draft where I go back through my research. And then, like you said, sometimes you realize you don't have what you need, and then you have to do some more research. So it never quite ends until the deadline. So
I think of my very dear and now departed friend, Sharon K. Penman, an author who I thought was brilliant and whom I really loved. And she wrote a lot of medieval stuff, but she was one who would say, you should never say they sat under a tree. You always had to say they sat under a beech, or they sat under an oak, or, she felt that specificity made the book more alive, more real, that you should avoid generalization if you could. In other words, you wouldn't leap on a horse necessarily. It would be a roan, or it would be, pinto, well, not a pinto, that's Western, black stallion, or whatever, And so if you do that, it would seem to me that you might have to adopt the parentheses method, just to make sure that, for example, did a beech tree really grow in, 11th century England, anywhere Eleanor of Aquitaine might have actually been. But, there we are. It took her forever to write her books. So maybe that wasn't the best approach, but she certainly did write amazing books, and you could learn so much from them. Sorry, PK, I keep waxing in. Carry on.
No. Betty Glover was curious. She said, did your research for one book provide new ideas for a different book than the one you're currently writing?
I
For me,
don't.
it did. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I don't know if I've run into that. If you have, Stephanie, yeah.
Yes, I guess I could run across different operations or missions that were done in intelligence or whatever during the war, or different. I'm really interested in all the little details that never come out actually in the normal history books or the normal articles or stories that are told about the war. So if I find some little bit of information that kind of piques my interest or curiosity, then if I can't use it in a current book, then I kind of put it away or tuck it away for use in the next book. And that has happened several times. So, I mean, I feel like I've spent so many hours researching World War II, and I barely scratched the surface. So that's, super fun, and good to know that there's plenty of material.
Yeah. I actually had a very specific incidents where, when I was researching the first book, I came across a real person. His name was Henry Busher Mills, and he was a snake catcher, is what they called him. Excuse me. And he actually mysteriously died at the very time that my second book was going to take place. And I thought, how can I not include a snake catcher in my second book when the timing is perfect? And his death was mysterious. So yeah, that definitely.
There's one other question that I have from the audience, and this is in regards to titles and covers. Some books have very similar titles, like somebody had a very similar title to one of your books this year, Dianne. So do you guys have any say in what those titles are, the cover art, anything like that in terms of the publishing process?
Yeah. We're all Kensington, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Definitely. I do. They ask, they've almost always have used my titles. Any title. Have you guys ever had titles changed on you?
I had one that they wanted me to tweak, but I just had to add, a little bit, but no, other than that, no.
Yeah. And then covers, I'm asked to submit every idea I can think of. And they usually use some sort of conglomeration of that. The only time I asked them to change it was they literally had the period wrong. And that was cover 2. I'm like, this just looks so 1950s. You guys have to change what they're wearing and things of that. But otherwise, yeah, I feel like I'm really lucky with my cover artist. She really gets the idea of it. And I love your covers, Clara.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
This is Diane's cover, so you can see.
Fine.
what she's talking about with the period costume. And I don't have Claire's book, but she's showing you also. Stephanie?
Yes, I have mine.
Yep. So yours does have, there's a very World War II look that I have found, and that one fits it very nicely. But I will also tell you, ladies, that Kensington is unusual in this because, in point of fact, with many publishers, the cover art is strictly up to the publisher, although the author gets to look at it and can have input. And titles are generally decided by the sales department and very often are not kept. We've had many a discussion, haven't we, PK, with authors about the various title evolutions that have occurred. In fact, we were talking to Megan Abbott about the turnout the other night, and that was a title that took a long time to come to. I sometimes get catalog copy and so forth for books, and it will say Untitled David Baldacci November, because that means the sales department and David have not come up with a title. But I think Kensington maybe works with its authors a little more than some other publishers. It's smaller and therefore more nimble. It's just one of those things. Did you find that true this morning, PK? Because we had a group of Kensington cozy authors this morning.
It seemed like they had a lot more say and a lot more, it seems like Kensington tends to work closer with their authors.
Yeah.
And they do, I think they do some really nice work with their cover art. So that's always nice to see. I like seeing the going back to the traditional hand painted covers and things like that, rather than just a photoshopped, picture in general.
Yeah.
I always think it adds something to the book. So, and it's unusual because I think I know I've had that conversation with plenty of a sci-fi writer who said, yeah, I didn't choose the title of the book, or, they got the cover completely, we asked, the cover doesn't seem to match the book at all. And it's because they, a marketing department or marketing person chose it versus the author, and they had no input. So,
and you might also notice that very often the hardcover cover art is different than the paperback cover art. I was looking up a book today, a debut by Rose Carlyle, a New Zealand author, which I really liked, and she and I spoke, and she wanted me to look up something. And when I did, I saw the paperback cover, which bore no relationship at all to the hardcover. So there's a different feeling oftentimes in publishing about what makes a paperback cover. But I think Kensington sticks to the same design. I can't remember. It seems to me, Dianne, that your paperbacks look just like your hardcovers, right?
They do. The audiobook covers are even the same. Just the large print is a subrights thing. So another publisher actually does that. They have a different cover.
And it's also interesting. We talked to a Swedish author on Thursday, and it's her first book translated into the US. And her Swedish cover was so different than the US cover. She held it up and we held ours up, and we talked about it. So there are different sensibilities in different countries. For oftentimes if we have an author that has a British edition and an American edition, we can see there are real differences. So, in how the books look. And sometimes the titles change. More often it's the covers. But, it's fascinating and I never am entirely clear on what basis all this occurs. They say it's data, but I'm not at all sure that's true. I'm skeptical about data. All right. Anything else, PK?
Just one very curious reader is curious what everybody is reading right now that they're loving.
Oh, great.
Writing nonfiction, I don't know. And Stephanie might like this. Last Hope Island.
Oh, I've heard of that actually, but I've not read it yet.
Everything she writes, I love. And she writes a lot about World War II. And this is really interesting how basically as the other countries in Europe kept trying or were conquered by Germany, their governments fled to England and were formed anew to kind of combat together. So they all ended up in Britain at Last Hope Island.
Who's the author, Diane?
Lynn Olson.
Lynn Olson?
Yeah, she also wrote Citizens of London and gosh, another one about World War II in the US, those something days, I can't remember. But she's really, I love nonfiction and she's really one of my favorite nonfiction authors.
Great. How about you, Stephanie? What are you reading?
I'm actually reading Evil Under the Sun by Agatha Christie. I'm pretty sure I read it years ago, but as something I was reading recently referenced it, and I realized I didn't remember it, and so I've gone back, and I always love to pick up an Agatha Christie.
It's hard to go wrong. Right. How about you, Claire?
I'm working my way through Ruth Downey's Medicus series, which is a
Wonderful.
kind of murder mysteries, kind of historical fiction set in Roman Britain, and I'm a huge fan. I think I can't always remember the titles because they're in Latin, but I think I'm up to book 7 in the series, and just I tell everyone I know, if you like historical mysteries, you like historical fiction, find Medicus and Ruth Downey. They're fabulous. Talk about historical accuracy and authenticity, and just you feel like you're there. It's fabulous. Okay, and she had one set more. So Downey,
Right,
Ruth Downey.
Yep, is Downie. Medicus is a Roman word for physician.
Doctor,
And he is in fact a doctor. And if I remember, because I've read them all too, isn't it set around Bath? I think it's Roman Bath.
They move all around. They even go to his
Okay.
homeland in Gaul, and one isn't set in York, and one was set up in Hadrian's Wall, and
Okay.
yeah, they're all over the place. So
Yep, it's a very good series. Some of you may have read Lindsay Davis's wonderful Roman mysteries as well, but Medicus is different. Anyway, that's a nice way to end it. So ladies, thank you very much for spending time with us this afternoon. And I want to thank all of you who joined us. If you know people who'd be interested in this, the Facebook video is going to live forever on our website, and there will be a podcast available for anybody who wants to download it probably tomorrow. So thank you so much for your participation. Let me wish you a great Saturday night. Bye, everybody.
thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.